It can be all too easy to get caught up in the moment, and believe that a really dangerous course of action is the best option, even if that action results or will result in rather devastating consequences. G'day mates and fellow adventurers, my name is Mordecai. An area where tabletop role-playing games really excel is the topic of team building. It's part of what makes having a diverse party appealing to the masses, with one of the common tropes being that the party is a band of misfits, which start off disjointed and uncoordinated, before developing into a cohesive, compelling unit of a group over the course of the campaign. Friendships and rivalries emerging within the party can even make the group fascinating to the players long term, with secret objectives and even appreciation for others. Unfortunately, this can sometimes lead to both in-character and out-of-character frustrations when one of the characters decides to behave in a manner which is ultimately detrimental to the entire party. And not just because it can tear up the entire group, but also since it can result in very real ramifications for friend groups outside of the game. Especially when the situation escalates to a point where serious discussions need to take place. Let's delve into the often terrifying world of r/RPG-horror-stories. Today's narrative is titled, Am I Justified in Being Peeved for How My Character Died Last Night? And is written by user BoysenberryWide627. I, a 24-year-old woman, have been playing in a campaign with a group of college friends and my boyfriend, a dungeon master, for about 5 years. We've seen a lot of people come and go and had our fair share of ups and downs, but throughout it all, I've always been sure to show up consistently and put a lot of effort into roleplaying, planning, and overall just interacting with the world my boyfriend has built for us. He is otherwise an amazing and engaging DM, which made what happened last night more frustrating. Our party had been enlisted to deal with an adult black dragon terrorizing the outskirts of a local village, which we gladly accepted. Upon reaching the swamps and finding the dragon currently patrolling the outskirts, we quickly realized that something was off, when the dragon appeared to be uninterested in engaging in combat with us, and didn't seem to recognize the deeds we accused it of doing. After a short-lived combat in which the dragon mostly attempted to ward us off with minions whilst it flew away from us, we were in fact able to bring it down. Upon which another dragon, a Draculich we had previously encountered a multitude of times before, appeared from the undergrowth, hissing in anger. Apparently, our chronic Draculich friend was hoping the Black Dragon would take us out before it would do the same in order to claim the dragon's territory, and upon realizing this wasn't the case, cursed us out before flying away, and leaving the remaining minions to deal with us before we took them all out. Now, initially, things went fine and were pretty amusing. Our ranger of all people was able to revivify the Black Dragon, much to the shock and horror of my Necromancer PC, and convinced it to temporarily aid us in fighting the Draculich due to a common enemy. After some persuasion, it agreed and took us back to its lair, where the Draculich had begun to make itself comfortable. A brawl between the dragons occurred when they started duking it out, whilst we alternated between throwing our help in when we could, whilst also dealing with a number of animated breath elementals the Draculich summoned. It was a grueling but fun combat, with a number of us brought unconscious a number of times and close to death. In the end though, the Draculich was dealt with, leaving us one final warning that he'd be back eventually as the light faded from his skeletal eyes. Now here is where it gets rough. Another one of our PCs, a Drow Paladin, was determined to deal with the Black Dragon next. Never mind the fact that the majority of us were below half health or even in the single digits, and I was almost entirely out of spell slots. He insisted that we needed to deal with the dragon before it could fully heal and threaten the townspeople again. My PC, who is romantically involved with him and tends to be the one to calm his moods, tried to reason with him by saying we were in no position to fight, and that we could always come back later with reinforcements to the dragon's lair, whilst the other party members chimed in with their own reasons, both in and out of character, as to why we weren't in a state to fight again. The Paladin proceeded to ignore all of us, and bluntly stated, "I attack the dragon," sending us into another round of initiative. Within minutes, almost all of us, save the Paladin, and our Ranger who managed to get into the Black Dragon's good graces to begin with, and was at least kept alive at 1 health point, are down. Still, the Paladin, and his player, focus on 1v1ing the dragon, leading to at least 20 minutes of us just sitting there, getting to do nothing as he has his main character moment. Eventually, the black dragon flies away from him, and coils around me and another player character, threatening the Paladin to give up before he kills us both. You know, his travelling companion and his romantic interest. Without any concern for us, the Paladin then responds by aiming a crossbow at him and firing at the dragon's scales, rolling low and missing entirely. Well, with that, the dragon rips my character's head clean off her body. I don't get a chance to have any final thoughts or words, I am simply beheaded. Something that Revivify cannot help with. My compatriot follows shortly afterwards, though she is only stabbed through the chest rather than having her head ripped off. Eventually, the Paladin also goes unconscious, and the dragon flies out of its lair and into the night. With 4 out of our 5 party members unconscious or dead, the Ranger gets to work stabilizing the Paladin, whilst also casting Sending to inform one of our core NPCs, a high-level cleric we'd befriended, of the carnage and asking them to send aid as soon as possible. Eventually this cleric comes by and is able to revivify my companion, but well, seeing as my head has been torn clean off my shoulders, there's nothing that can be done for me. At this point, I am livid and genuinely upset. Perhaps I was taking it a bit too seriously, but this is a character I'd played for 5 years, and had gotten incredibly attached to. For her to die due to another character's impulsivity, with no voice or chance to even announce how I'd like to die, was incredibly disheartening. Especially as I had an idea of how such a thing could play out if it did happen, with my necromancy character having a deeply inset fear of death that spurred her into her studies. But I wasn't even granted the ability to roleplay my own death with agency. I was furious at my paladin friend for his selfishness, but also at my boyfriend, who could have stopped this at any time, but decided to keep fueling the fire. I directly messaged him separately, expressing my upset, and whilst he consoled me by saying he was sorry that this had to happen, and that the party would eventually find a way to fix me, he had to teach the other player character the consequences of rash and impulsive decisions. Which only made me more mad, because why did me and that other player have to die because of another character's nonsense? It only got worse when I requested we end the session early, and I attempted to make my grievances known with the Paladin, who left the call shortly afterwards and, according to another friend who was acting as a neutral party, texted to say he felt like he was being targeted for his decisions and that he wasn't going to apologize for neutralizing a clearly evil threat, even though the dragon still got away, with nothing to show for his efforts but a near total party wipeout. I left the call to cool down, after stating I wanted to talk about this further with everyone at a later date. My boyfriend has texted me since then apologizing and asking if we could talk privately, whilst the Paladin has said nothing to me but posted in our group chat that he would also like to talk soon in order to say his piece. I haven't responded to either. I'm extremely bummed out and not quite sure where to go from here. I don't want to make a new character after so many years of roleplaying my necromancer, but I also don't want to roleplay and solidify the actions of what happened here tonight. I also don't know if I want to leave the campaign just yet, saving that decision for how our next group conversation goes. Any advice or words of support anyone has for me would be much appreciated at the moment. But that's not quite where the story ends, since we do have an update to the story. Before we proceed to read the update, let's take a step back and consider the story as it stands, since there are a few things that we need to discuss. The first aspect that causes frustration is the consequences for actions, or rather, how the rest of the party faced all of the major consequences whilst the Paladin didn't. Because the Paladin didn't have to deal with their specific character having to die fighting the formerly friendly dragon, they firmly believe that they did nothing wrong. Instead, they got to live whilst their love interest in-game was killed after the Paladin was given a chance to back down, which is unfortunately an instance where consequences were mishandled. The simplest solution would have been to have the dragon focus solely on the Paladin during combat and bring them to defeat without necessarily killing them. That way, the consequences are at least more focused on the character, and thus they can more clearly see how their actions resulted in disaster. It can also be a learning opportunity for the DM on how to handle consequences in a manner that isn't as aggravating for the group. You might be wondering how the Paladin came to the conclusion that the dragon is evil, and whilst we don't get to see their particular reasoning, there is a more universal explanation to do with the lore behind Dungeons & Dragons, and oddly enough has to do with elements of game design. Because Dungeons & Dragons has a little something called Adventurers League that you may have heard of, which predominantly focuses on combat and puzzles above genuine roleplay, the design has to call for enemies which are evil, so that players always have something that they can fight, especially in modules. But this isn't an Adventurers League game. It isn't necessarily bound by the established lore, and from the behaviour and mannerisms that the Black Dragon has shown, we can conclude that the dragon probably isn't evil. To keep it short, at a homebrew game, you can't lean on the standard lore. I know how walkabout that sounds. To put it simply, OP had every right to be frustrated in the moment, but there are a few other things to consider about the situation. Being in the situation at the time the story took place, everyone has decided to have a walkabout to calm down before any discussions take place about potential resolutions, which is arguably the best course of action, since being in an angry situation tends to make people act irrationally and say all kinds of nasty stuff that they regret saying later. At this stage, my advice would be to sit down and have a conversation after everyone has calmed down. And with that, we shall now move on to the update in all of its glory. The update is titled, Update, Am I Justified in Being Peeved for How My Character Died Last Night? In the time since the original post, the group had a conversation about what happened, so let's read what happened next. I'm really happy to say our group talk went well. After all of us having time enough to cool down and consider each other's perspectives, we Skyped in and I calmly laid out how the prior session had made me feel. Helped by a lot, thanks to your comments, Reddit villagers, which articulated my feelings and arguments in a more concise way than I could have provided at the moment. Both my boyfriend/DM and the Paladin were incredibly receptive, and listened to my grievances with a lot of understanding, with the Paladin even apologising for his behaviour and saying he realised that he got caught up in the moment and failed to consider his fellow party members' feelings, and that he left the call initially because he wanted to cool down, and not make the situation worse in the moment. I also owed the Paladin an apology for angrily calling him an idiot in the moment, which I provided and he accepted pretty gracefully. Whilst we ultimately decided a retcon/rewind back to the moment where the Dracolich fell would be the best action in order to avoid any long-term hard feelings, going forward, we've all collectively decided to utilise a timeout and talk option if we feel things are starting to go south, or one party member is beginning to cause issues in/out of game. Furthermore, my boyfriend stated that whilst he wanted to make sure the campaign still had its moments of tenseness and stakes, and there would inevitably be moments similar to this where party members could and would die, he would ensure that no party member was being unfairly punished or targeted, especially for another's actions. Everyone was really mature about the whole affair, and after laying everything out on the table, we agreed to pick up where we left off next weekend and parted ways feeling a lot better. While it is not a particularly spicy ending, it is a satisfying one, and I am glad that my friendship with the Paladin or my relationship with my boyfriend wasn't negatively affected by this going forward. I wanted to thank you all for the supportive comments and advice, as I think it made a difference in my phrasing of my frustrations and kept the bonus on solving the problem as a group rather than lashing out. And that's where the story ends. Or is it? We also have a comment from OP in the thread for this update, responding to a question from Reddit villager Jaffro Boy, and here's what they had to say. Well, that's good. Did he explain why he had the dragon kill you, but leave the Paladin alive and unconscious, when the Paladin was the whole problem, and the one attacking it? At that point, A, he was feeling like he might have already gone too far in killing two-player characters, and, sensing the tension, wanted to end the encounter as soon as possible, and B, his in-character reasoning was that the Black Dragon was intelligent enough that it wanted to take out any ranged threats, like my wizard, that might help the Paladin fight it. Even though, again, none of us fought back and ended up downed in a single turn by the breath weapon anyways, but I digress, and use us as leverage to keep the Paladin from attacking further. He acknowledged it was pretty lame reasoning, and that he should have either gone for the full TPK, or just stuck to targeting the Paladin solely, which even the Paladin agreed with, and claimed he was trying to initiate by taunting the dragon, and trying to have its attention focused solely on him. And that's where the story really ends. There is something to be said for taking away a warning from this story about the dangers of getting carried away in the moment. Because sometimes when a person gets really into the fair dinkum situation such as a pitched boss fight, there is a tendency to remain caught up in that momentum. And like any physics force, having too much momentum can cause accidents that leave people fairly upset. Obviously, this is one of the best case scenarios resulting from communicating with your fellow players to reach a resolution. We have had an uplifting conversation that has resulted in a solution to the situation, that being a retroactive drawback to a previous story event in the form of defeating the Dracolich, and having no lasting negative repercussions for the group. In addition to the resolution, the group now also has some safety measures put in place to prevent these situations from getting completely out of hand in the future. Even though this story has ended in a satisfying way, there are still considerations and warnings that players can learn from for their own problem situations. Resolving problem situations can involve more than just being aware of the potential downfall of the group as a result of mishandled consequences, or having a character misunderstand the situation. Sometimes you will need to take action to prevent the collapse of the gaming group. My advice for groups facing similar issues would be to take a step back when the situation gets extremely aggravating, cool off, and then attempt to get the situation properly resolved. Especially if everyone in the situation is just extremely angry. Thank you for watching the video. If you like my content and want to see more or wish to support the channel, please hit the subscribe button and maybe leave the video a like. It's free to do, and every bit of support is highly appreciated. Again, thank you for watching, and I shall see you all next time.